What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a discussion video talking about the sort of trend, I guess you could call it, of a lot of game studios making CRPGs, especially notable ones, before ultimately kind of letting the genre go and transitioning into other stuff. This is something I wanted to talk about since the initial announcement of The Expanse: Osiris Reborn, which is going to be a sort of Mass Effect-like from Owlcat Games, which triggered some of that sentiment being expressed here and there, which is what inspired me to talk about it. I'm just taking a little while to actually get around to it, but probably worth a mention straight away that in the case of Owlcat, they are also continuing to work on isometric CRPGs, so I don't think it's necessarily true in their case specifically, but if you do a little digging, that trend does tend to hold water. And it just so happens that it wouldn't be the first time in history that people have moved away from the CRPG genre anyway, as, if you're unaware, we are currently in, or perhaps past the peak of, with something like Baldur's Gate 3 actually, what you might see people online refer to as the CRPG Renaissance, which kind of rode a Kickstarter wave in the early 2010s into the success that we saw with a variety of titles in the past few years. So what I want to do with this video is basically just kind of talk about some of the repeating patterns, some of the history there, and kind of just discuss that trend generally. Probably worth a mention here towards the beginning, though, that this isn't leading towards any like prophetic revelations or assumptions or predictions or anything like that. Really, the only thing I would predict is that the genre itself won't ever actually die, because if anything, thanks to people like indie developers, there's always going to be some movement and interest there. But as with basically any video game genre, there's been an interesting amount of history and evolutions of it over the years, so I think the idea of the industry changing or evolving at large is hardly new, and the fact that you would just want to make one type of game forever is its own conversation, I think. But when it comes to CRPGs, the sort of modern interpretation of the genre really starts to take shape right around the end of the 90s, with the release of stuff like Fallout and Baldur's Gate 1, etc. Those games are so influential at the time that they kind of wound up changing the meaning of the word eventually. So at one point, especially when video games were just getting started, CRPG just basically meant any RPG on a computer, which is an extremely broad definition, but at the time when PCs weren't so popular, which is to say like the end of the 1970s, it made a little more sense. So from like 1977, give or take, depending on who you ask, until about 1998, the meaning was entirely different. As I just mentioned, games like Fallout, Baldur's Gate 1 really kicked off a ton of interest in this genre, which then led to more entries in it, like, for instance, all of the Infinity Engine games. And that went on for several years into the 2000s until interest started to wane, which was right around 2003, 2004, where there was suddenly a very steep drop-off for the genre that really didn't see much in the way of entries outside of a couple of notable ones and then some smaller indie titles for about 10 years. And I tell you all this because those developers either went defunct or they weren't sitting around and doing nothing, they simply moved away from the genre, which is kind of how it connects back to what I want to talk about here. In particular, though, I would say the releases of things like Temple of Elemental Evil as well as Lionheart Legacy of the Crusader really being the titles that kind of marked the end of that particular era before things went mostly quiet before the Kickstarter wave of the early 2010s. Now, straight away, I probably should mention here that it was not a completely dead period. In fact, one of the more popular CRPGs that isn't even isometric launched during this time, which is, of course, Dragon Age Origins. Now, curiously, Mass Effect also released around this time, but was just straight up not a CRPG. And that actually released a bit before Dragon Age Origins, and then Jade Empire before both of those. And following that line, you can clearly see BioWare steadily moving away from the genre, even if it played around with it here and there. Now, I think BioWare is a really notable company to talk about in this respect because they made one of the only, really big CRPGs during this period, and even they completely dropped it. Because Origins is, ironically, I would say, the last actual CRPG they made. But before we get into the resurgence, it's important, I think, for the sake of this video to talk about, some of the things that went into the drop-off. Why did that happen? Well, I like anything, think it is ultimately down to more than one individual factor, but a big part of it really was in the early 2000s, there was this really big push into, exploration of like 3D tech and everything, and obviously isometric games, which the genre primarily consisted of, just really weren't what people were wanting to play at the time. And there was this also, sort of concurrent push to widen the market, basically, make games that were more accessible, utilizing new technology like that to, of course, appeal to bigger audiences, and thus more complicated games that were more difficult to play by their very nature kind of fell by the wayside. And despite all of that, I still think it's important to mention that while their fall-off is notable and measurable, it never actually killed off the genre in any way. There clearly was still a lot of interest in these games. They were, simply put, kind of just put on the back burner more than anything else. And then the early 2010s happen, Kickstarter becomes a thing, and some companies, quite a few actually, really rode Kickstarter and crowdfunding to capitalize on consumer interest in the genre that the actual industry was not providing them, to sort of just directly fund this stuff. And it's through that Kickstarter wave we got things like Pillars of Eternity, Divinity Original Sin 1, the Shadowrun series, Wasteland 2, and then even ultimately a couple sequels to those titles also went the crowdfunding route. But it's worth a mention that even that actually saw interest wane as those games picked up success and everything, the companies who made them often being bought up by Microsoft actually. So while you still do see the occasional CRPG Kickstarter, it has become a lot more rare than it was 10 years ago. Continuing to note shifting markets, but this is where we really see that trend happening again, because most of the companies involved in these all made a couple of pretty successful, in most cases, CRPGs before being like, alright, that's enough of that, and moving on to other things. Probably the easiest to highlight is actually Obsidian. So they kickstarted things like Pillars of Eternity 1, they went through, I think it was Fig for Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire. In between the two Pillars games, they made another CRPG called Tyranny, which is really great. And for reasons that aren't really a secret, they started moving away from the success of those titles after they started struggling with sales, mainly with Deadfire being the notable one, as that game took a long time to become profitable. And obviously you don't want every game you make to be a problem with sales and everything, especially given Obsidian's history. That is to say, some of their struggle with finances, especially. Though coincidentally, during the sort of deader period for CRPGs, Obsidian was also still making CRPGs at that time. That is to say, KOTOR 2 or Neverwinter Nights 2 as an example. But even they, from like 2007 until the release of Pillars of Eternity in 2015, and the Kickstarter before that, of course, were definitely working on different projects doing different things. Another interesting one is In Exile Entertainment, who kickstarted Wasteland 2 during that time, though notably dropped Kickstarter for Wasteland 3 as an example. But even they moved on from CRPGs after Wasteland 3 to ultimately make the more accessible action title, it would seem, with the upcoming Clockwork Revolution. There are some smaller studios that also went this route before kind of moving away from it as well, though. For instance, we've got Shadowrun Returns, and then the rest of the Shadowrun trilogy from Harebrained Schemes. And while the Shadowrun trilogy didn't get quite as much love as the other games on this list, it was still a really big success for them. Unfortunately, Harebrained Schemes also moved away from the CRPG genre, but also probably more so than many of the other companies on this list. They are currently making some like survival horror RPG called Graft, I believe, following, of course, the TRPG Lamplighters League, which caused a bit of a falling out between them and Paradox, their publisher for it. And then, of course, there's one of my favorite studios, which we've already talked a little bit about, which is Owlcat Games. Now, as I mentioned, they have not completely moved away from the genre. They are actively developing an isometric CRPG right now that's already been announced, Dark Heresy, but via Kickstarter for both Pathfinder Kingmaker and Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, they also made a bunch of really successful CRPGs, moved away from Kickstarter to make more CRPGs via things like Rogue Trader, the upcoming Dark Heresy as an example, and then they're also using that to branch out into other genres at the same time. Now, if you were to just look at those examples, I definitely could see how you get the impression that people make CRPGs and they move away from the genre, whether it winds up being successful or not. Now, there's a variety of market factors in that. I also honestly think at some point you probably want to make something else besides essentially the same genre of game to test yourself creatively. You just kind of let a studio stretch their legs, so to speak. So there are reasons to sort of just make other stuff that probably is entirely natural and the cause of just any creative endeavor. But what I think just looking at those major studios also ignores is all of the smaller CRPGs that get released all the time. Just within the past week or so, we saw the release of The Necromancer's Tale, which I'm currently in the middle of, a game called Sector Unknown, which I really liked, launched into early access. Neverwinter Nights 2 itself got a enhanced edition, and then if we start looking towards the future, there's all sorts of stuff being developed right now. New Arc Line is in early access, Solasta 2 is in active development, and other small titles like Banquet for Fools, Swordhaven, or The Way of Wrath. So while it is kind of easy on one hand to point to all of these major players making well-received CRPGs and then moving on, there's also just I would say, smaller revolution in the sense that there are so many indie companies making really interesting CRPGs that are worth people's time, even if they aren't as big. And so while it may very well be true that some people go from CRPG to inevitable some form of like third or first person action oriented RPG, that the love for the genre is alive and well. And as a result of that, I really don't think it's going anywhere, even during the period in which most people referred to it as, kind of dead. It didn't technically die then either, as we were actually seeing CRPG releases, just, minimal ones of note. So when you look at the entire picture anyway, I think while that sort of observation of the trend definitely makes a lot of sense, I'm also just not really worried about the genre as a whole either. Because at least here in 2025, I kind of think it's, healthier than it has ever been in its history. So while there might be some hiccups along the way, I also think there are still going to be some exciting years to come in terms of this genre. But even if it does wind up falling off again and there's a quiet lull, I think this genre of games has proven time and time again that it is shockingly resilient and is always going to be kicking around in one form or another. But I think that's probably a good place to leave off on this particular video. An entirely unnecessary amount of rambling about just a general sentiment I noticed in the community over the last month or so. And hopefully you got something for all that. Mostly it was just a fun thing for me to talk about, and so I did. So if you'd like to hear more of that, or if you want to see me cover more CRPGs in the future, which is likely a more reasonable take, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.